Sometimes the loneliest people have the biggest hearts. Sometimes the wildest creatures know exactly who they can trust. Old Silas Cobb had spent 30 winters alone in his mountain cabin after his wife passed. When 5 grizzly bears scratched at his door during a terrible snowstorm, he could have grabbed his rifle. Instead, he opened the door and shared his fire. The next morning, 20 more bears were sitting outside his cabin, waiting patiently, like they knew something special about this old mountain man. Word had spread through the wilderness about someone who would never turn away a soul in need. But what happens when the snow melts and these wild visitors have to go back to being wild? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin sat like a weathered prayer against the mountainside, its log walls darkened by decades of Montana storms and seasons that had come and gone with the regularity of an old man's breathing. Silas Cobb had built those walls himself, back when his hands were steady and his back was strong, back when Martha had stood beside him, pointing out where the kitchen window should go to catch the morning light. That was 32 years ago, though he'd only been alone for the last 30. The structure had aged gracefully, settling into the landscape as if it had grown there naturally. Moss crept up the north side, where the sun never reached, and the roof bore a patina of pine needles that had accumulated through countless autumns. A stone chimney rose from the center, its smoke mixing with the mountain air in a way that seemed as old as the peaks themselves. Silas had crafted every joint, fitted every log, and chinked every gap with a mixture of clay and determination that had kept the wind at bay through 3 decades of solitude. Inside, the cabin held the accumulated weight of a life lived quietly but deeply. Martha's quilts still draped the chairs she'd favored, their patterns telling stories of seasons and celebrations that had long since passed into memory. Her teacup sat on the kitchen shelf, unwashed since the morning she'd taken her last sip, as if Silas expected her to return from some errand and finish what she'd started. The cast-iron stove dominated one corner, its belly glowing red on cold mornings, like the one that would soon test every principle Silas had lived by. He was 73 years old that winter, though the mountains had a way of making a man's age feel both irrelevant and profound. His beard had gone the color of fresh snow, and his hands carried the maps of every tool he'd ever wielded, every fence he'd mended, every kindness he'd offered to the creatures that shared his wilderness home. Silas had never been a large man, but the mountains had carved him into something essential, stripping away everything unnecessary until only the core remained. The nearest neighbor lived 18 miles down the mountain, and the nearest town was a 40-minute drive on roads that became impassable when the snow flew hard. Most folks thought Silas lived too far from civilization, but he'd never seen it that way. Civilization, to his thinking, was what happened when people remembered how to treat each other with decency. And he'd found more of that quality in the animals that visited his clearing than in most of the towns he'd left behind. Every morning, Silas followed the same ritual that had sustained him through the years since Martha's passing. He'd rise before dawn, kindle the fire that had never truly died in his stove, and set the coffee to brewing in the same tin pot Martha had used. The pot was dented and blackened from years of use, but it made coffee the way she taught him, strong enough to wake the dead and smooth enough to ease a man into another day of solitude. While the coffee worked its magic, he'd step onto his covered porch and survey his domain. The clearing stretched perhaps 100 yards in each direction before the forest reclaimed its territory. He'd cut those trees himself, creating a pocket of civilization that still felt wild enough to honor the land's original intentions. A woodshed stood to the east, stacked with enough split pine and fir to last through the worst winter the mountains could deliver. A small barn housed the supplies he couldn't afford to lose to weather or wildlife, though he'd learned over the years that sharing often brought more security than hoarding. The ritual continued with feeding, not just himself, but the community of creatures that had learned to trust his generosity. Silas had never intended to become the mountain's unofficial caretaker, but kindness had a way of spreading, and word traveled fast in the wilderness when someone could be counted on for a meal or shelter when times grew hard. First came the birds, ravens mostly, intelligent creatures that had learned his schedule better than most people learned their neighbors' habits. They'd perch on the porch railing, cawing their morning greetings, while Silas scattered crumbs from yesterday's biscuits. The ravens had names, though Silas had never spoken them aloud. There was old Moses, distinguished by a white patch on his breast, and Martha's bird, a female who'd shown up the day after the funeral and never left. After the ravens came the smaller creatures, squirrels, chipmunks, the occasional fox if the mood struck them right. Silas had learned their preferences over the years, the way a good bartender learns his customers' drinks. The squirrels favored nuts he'd gathered in autumn, stored in coffee tins that rattled like rain when he shook them. The chipmunks preferred seeds, which he'd scatter in specific spots around the clearing, so each creature could feed without competition. But it was the larger animals that had taught Silas the most about the nature of trust. Over the years, deer had learned to graze in his clearing without fear, sensing somehow that this particular human meant no harm. A black bear named Bruno, though the bear certainly didn't know that name, had been visiting for 7 years, arriving each spring as predictable as the first wildflowers and disappearing each fall as the snows began. Bruno had been the first to test the boundaries of Silas's generosity. The bear had appeared one evening, drawn by the smell of fish Silas was cooking for supper. Instead of reaching for his rifle, Silas had simply watched from his window as Bruno investigated the cabin's perimeter. When the bear approached the porch, Silas had done something that still surprised him in memory. He'd opened the door and tossed half his supper onto the ground. That gesture had established a relationship built on mutual respect. Bruno learned that Silas would share but never surrender. And Silas learned that some wild creatures were capable of gratitude in ways that would humble a man if he let himself think about it too deeply. The understanding between them had grown over the seasons. Bruno would arrive, announce himself with a soft woof that sounded almost polite, and wait for Silas to acknowledge his presence. Silas would prepare whatever he could spare, fish when he'd been lucky, berries when they were in season, sometimes just a pan of cornbread that Martha's recipe could stretch to feed both man and bear. Other bears had learned about Silas's generosity through whatever communication network existed in the wild. They arrived with the caution of creatures who'd learned to expect the worst from humans. But they left with the satisfaction of those who discovered an exception to every rule they'd ever known about survival. The pattern had repeated with other species. Wolves had tested his boundaries and found them fair. Elk had learned that his clearing offered not just grazing, but protection from the hunters who respected no boundaries but their own. Even the mountain cats, creatures so solitary they made Silas look sociable, had been known to accept his offerings when the hunting grew thin. Through it all, Silas had maintained the routines that kept him anchored to purpose. He rose early, tended his fire, brewed his coffee, and cared for whoever needed caring. He split wood in the afternoons, repaired what needed repairing, and read by lamplight in the evenings from books that Martha had loved. He wrote letters to relatives who lived in distant cities, though he rarely mailed them, finding that the act of writing was comfort enough. The loneliness was real, but it was manageable, like a chronic ache that flared with changes in weather but never quite disappeared. Silas had learned to live with it the way he'd learned to live with the altitude, accepting it as part of the landscape, neither fighting it nor surrendering to it completely. But 30 years of solitude had taught him something else, something he hadn't expected when Martha first took sick, and the doctors started using words like time and prepare yourself. He'd learned that kindness was its own reward, that generosity created its own warmth, and that sharing what little he had somehow multiplied it in ways that made no mathematical sense but perfect. Emotional logic. This wisdom would be tested on a night when the wind howled like all the lonely souls who'd ever walked the earth. When the snow fell so hard, it seemed like the sky was emptying itself of everything it had ever held. And when 5 grizzly bears would approach his door, seeking something they'd never asked of a human being before, the storm that changed everything began as just another weather system moving across the continental divide. But Silas could read the signs, the way the ravens gathered in unusual numbers, the silence that fell over the forest like a held breath, the particular quality of light that warned experienced mountain dwellers to prepare for something extraordinary. He spent the day before the storm making his usual preparations, but with an urgency he couldn't quite explain. He brought in extra wood, checked his supplies, and filled every container he owned with water from the spring that fed his clearing. Something in the air told him this storm would be different, that it would test more than just his preparation and endurance. As evening approached and the first flakes began to fall, Silas settled into his chair by the fire with a cup of coffee and one of Martha's favorite books. The wind began to sing its ancient song, and the snow began to fall, with the determination of winter making its final, definitive statement about who ruled these mountains. He had no way of knowing that 5 exhausted grizzly bears were making their way toward his cabin, driven by instincts they didn't understand, toward a man who'd spent 30 years learning that survival and kindness were not mutually exclusive. The storm arrived with the fury of something personal, as if winter itself had taken offense at the audacity of humans trying to carve out a life in these high places. By midnight, the wind was throwing snow against Silas's windows with such force it sounded like handfuls of gravel being hurled by an angry giant. The cabin groaned under the assault, its aged timbers speaking in languages only old buildings knew, creaking protests and wooden whispers that Silas had learned to interpret over 3 decades of mountain storms. He'd seen blizzards before, survived them, even found a strange comfort in their wild honesty. But this storm carried something different in its voice, a desperation that made even a man accustomed to nature's extremes pause and listen more carefully. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes, and the snow was falling so thick that the world beyond his windows had simply disappeared, as if his cabin had been transported to some white void where nothing existed but wind and cold and the stubborn determination of one old man's fire. Silas sat in his leather chair, the one Martha had insisted they buy for his birthday 15 years before she passed, listening to the storm's conversation with his home. The fire in his stove had been fed 3 times since sunset, its iron belly glowing red-hot against the advancing cold that seeped through every crack and crevice despite his careful chinking. He held his coffee cup with both hands, drawing warmth not just from the liquid, but from the memory of every morning Martha had filled that same cup, had stood beside him at this same window, watching weather roll across their mountain kingdom. The first sound came at midnight, so soft and tentative that Silas almost dismissed it as another voice in the storm's symphony. But something about the rhythm made him set down his cup and tilt his head toward the door. 3 soft scratches, a pause, then 3 more, too deliberate to be wind-blown debris, too gentle to be a branch scraping against the porch. Silas rose from his chair with the careful movements of a man whose joints had absorbed 30 mountain winters. He moved to the window beside his door, wiping condensation from the glass with his sleeve, and peered into the white chaos beyond. At first, he saw nothing but the horizontal slash of snow caught in the pale light spilling from his windows. Then just at the edge of that light, a shadow shifted. The shadow was massive, easily the size of a small automobile, and it moved with the distinctive rolling gait that Silas had learned to recognize over years of sharing his mountain with its original inhabitants. A grizzly bear, and from its size, an old male that had survived enough winters to know when seeking shelter, trumped maintaining territorial pride. 3 more scratches on the door, followed by a sound Silas had never heard from a wild bear, a soft woof of breath that sounded almost like a request. almost like a question being asked in a language older than words. Most men would have reached for a weapon. Most men would have shouted threats or warnings, would have barricaded their doors and waited for daylight to reveal whether they'd survived the night. But Silas Cobb was not most men. 30 years of living alone had taught him to trust his instincts, and 30 years of feeding the mountain's creatures had taught him to read the difference between aggression and desperation. He moved to his door, his hand resting on the wooden latch Martha had carved from a piece of driftwood they'd found during their honeymoon by Flathead Lake. Through the thick wood, he could hear breathing, not the rapid panting of a creature preparing to attack, but the deep, exhausted respiration of something that had traveled far and found its strength nearly spent. "Easy now," Silas murmured, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to the bear or to himself. His fingers worked the latch with practiced ease, and he pulled the door open just wide enough to see what the storm had delivered to his threshold. 5 grizzly bears stood on his porch, their massive forms barely visible through the driving snow. They were arranged not in an aggressive formation, but in a huddle, the larger bears forming a protective circle around smaller ones. A family group, Silas realized, that had been caught in the open when the storm struck with unexpected violence. The largest bear, the old male who'd done the scratching, stood closest to the door. His fur was matted with ice, and his eyes held an expression Silas had seen before in the faces of travelers who'd lost their way and found themselves dependent on the kindness of strangers. Behind him, a female with 2 cubs pressed close to her sides, and another smaller bear, perhaps a yearling from the previous season, completed the group. In that moment, with the wind howling around them and the temperature dropping toward numbers that could kill even creatures as hardy as grizzlies, Silas faced a choice that would define not just this night, but everything that followed. He could close the door, secure his cabin, and let nature take its course. He could fire a warning shot, drive them back into the storm, and trust that their wild instincts would see them through. Instead, he stepped back and opened the door wide. "Come on then," he said, his voice carrying the same tone he'd used to call Martha in for supper, the same gentle invitation he'd offered to every creature that had ever sought refuge in his clearing. "Can't have you freezing to death on my porch." The old male entered first, moving with the careful dignity of a guest who understood the magnitude of the gift being offered. He shook the snow from his coat just inside the door, sending ice crystals flying across Martha's braided rug, then moved toward the far corner of the room where the heat from the stove was strongest, but where he wouldn't block the path for the others. The female followed, nudging her cubs ahead of her with gentle pushes of her massive head. The cubs, barely larger than dogs, but already showing the powerful build they'd inherit, moved with the curious fearlessness of the very young. They sniffed at Silas's boots, at the furniture legs, at the smells of a human life lived quietly but fully. The yearling came last, moving with the awkward uncertainty of adolescence, old enough to understand danger, but young enough to trust in the protection of the family group. It settled near the others, and within minutes, the corner of Silas's cabin had been transformed into a bear nursery. 5 massive creatures arranged in a configuration that spoke of family bonds stronger than the fear of humans, that had been bred into their bones over generations of survival. Silas closed the door against the storm and turned to survey his transformed home. The bears watched him with the alertness of wild creatures, but without the tension that would have preceded an attack. They were wet, cold, and exhausted, and they seemed to understand that this human represented safety rather than threat. Moving slowly and deliberately, Silas went to his kitchen and began assembling what he could spare from his winter stores. A pot of last night's stew, still thick with venison and vegetables from his garden. A loaf of bread Martha's recipe had taught him to make, dense with grains and honey. A jar of preserves put up from summer berries, sweetness saved against the lean months of winter. He set the food in bowls and pans near the bears, not close enough to seem pushy, but near enough to be accessible. The old male approached first, sniffing cautiously before beginning to eat with the delicate manners of a creature raised in the wild, but educated by hunger. The others followed, and soon the sound of feeding joined the storm's symphony, a peaceful counterpoint to the chaos outside. Silas settled back into his chair, watching his unexpected guests with the satisfaction of a host whose invitation had been accepted graciously. The warmth from his stove seemed to expand, filling not just the physical space of the cabin, but something deeper, some hollow place in his chest that had been empty for 30 years. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountain, but inside, something remarkable was taking place. A man who'd lived alone was no longer alone, and creatures who'd never trusted humans had found a human worthy of their trust. The night was far from over, and neither Silas nor his guests had any way of knowing that word was already spreading through the wilderness. Carried by instincts and communications older than human civilization, by morning everything would change. But for now, in the warm circle of firelight, 5 bears slept peacefully in a human dwelling, and one old man discovered that the heart's capacity for wonder never diminished, no matter how many winters it had endured. Dawn came slowly through the storm, a gradual lightening of the white chaos outside Silas's windows that suggested the world might still exist beyond the walls of his cabin. The wind had softened from its midnight fury to a steady moan, and the snow had changed from the horizontal assault of the night to fat, lazy flakes that drifted down like feathers from some celestial pillow fight. Silas woke in his chair, his neck stiff from sleeping upright, his coffee cup empty and cold in his lap. For a moment, the disorientation was complete. Why had he slept in his chair? Why did his cabin smell different? Why did the air feel thick with the breathing of more than one creature? Then memory returned, and he turned his head toward the corner where his guests had settled for the night. The 5 bears were still there, arranged in the same protective huddle they'd formed when they first entered. The cubs were pressed against their mother's warm belly, their small bodies rising and falling with the deep rhythm of young creatures who could sleep through anything when they felt truly safe. The yearling had sprawled across the floor with the abandon of adolescence, one massive paw draped over what had been Martha's favorite footstool. The old male sat upright against the wall, his eyes open and alert, watching Silas with the patient attention of a sentry who took his responsibilities seriously. When their eyes met, the bear offered that same soft woof of acknowledgement he'd used at the door, a sound that carried gratitude and respect in equal measure. Silas nodded in return, a gesture that felt as natural as any conversation he'd ever held with another human being. "Morning," Silas said quietly, testing whether his voice would disturb the sleepers. The cubs stirred but didn't wake, and the mother bear opened one eye, assessed the situation, and settled back into her rest with the confidence of a parent who trusted the safety of their surroundings. Silas rose from his chair with care, his joints protesting the night's impromptu sleeping arrangement. The movement brought him into contact with Martha's old wooden treasure box, a simple pine chest she'd kept beside his chair and filled with items that had mattered to her. Letters from her sister, pressed flowers from their anniversary walks, the silver thimble her grandmother had passed down through 3 generations of mountain women. The box had remained untouched since her passing, too sacred to disturb but too precious to put away. This morning, for reasons he couldn't entirely explain, Silas lifted the lid and withdrew a small item wrapped in tissue paper, Martha's sewing kit, a leather pouch that contained needles, thread, and the small scissors she'd used to mend everything from torn clothing to wounded animals they'd found in the forest. Looking at the sleeping bears, particularly the cubs whose fur showed the roughness of a hard winter, Silas found himself remembering the way Martha had tended to creatures in need. She'd had gentle hands and an instinct for healing that extended far beyond the human world. More than once, she'd brought injured animals into their home, nursing them back to health with a combination of practical knowledge and intuitive care that had amazed him then and moved him now. The storm's intensity was diminishing, But the depth of snow outside made it clear that his guests wouldn't be leaving any time soon. The drifts against his windows rose nearly to the sills, and the familiar landmarks of his clearing had been erased by the white uniformity of deep snow. Even creatures as powerful as grizzly bears would struggle to make progress in such conditions, especially with cubs to protect. Silas moved to his kitchen, beginning the morning ritual that had sustained him through 30 years of solitude. The coffee pot, his dented, faithful companion, went onto the stove, its familiar weight and balance reassuring in a morning that had already proven full of surprises. The sound of heating water joined the soft breathing of his guests, creating a domestic symphony that filled the cabin with unexpected peace. While the coffee brewed, he took inventory of his supplies, with the eye of a man suddenly responsible for feeding more than himself. His winter stores were adequate for one person living carefully, but 5 bears, even grateful, well-mannered bears, would strain his resources if they stayed long. The storm showed no signs of ending soon, and even after it passed, the cleanup would take days. From his pantry, he retrieved the ingredients for what Martha had called necessity biscuits, a recipe that could stretch to feed unexpected company and still provide substantial nourishment. Flour, cornmeal, a precious bit of bacon fat saved from his last hunting success, and honey from the hives he maintained at the edge of his clearing. The familiar process of mixing and kneading the dough brought back memories of countless mornings when Martha had worked beside him, her hands moving with the practiced grace of someone who understood that feeding others was an act of love. As he worked, Silas became aware that the old male bear was watching him with intense interest. Not the predatory focus of a creature considering an attack, but the curious attention of an intelligent being trying to understand the rituals of another species. When Silas moved to the stove to check the coffee, the bear shifted slightly to maintain his line of sight, following the human's movements with the dedication of a student learning from a master. The interaction sparked something in Silas's memory, Martha's voice, clear as if she were standing beside him, reminding him of something she'd read about bears and their remarkable intelligence. They were curious creatures, she'd said, capable of learning and remembering far more than most people gave them credit for. They could solve problems, recognize individuals, and even demonstrate what appeared to be gratitude for kindness received. Looking at the old male now, Silas began to understand that last night's arrival hadn't been entirely random. Somehow, whether through scent trails, vocalizations he couldn't hear, or instincts he couldn't comprehend, word had spread through the wildlife community about the human who could be trusted in times of need. These bears hadn't just stumbled onto his porch, they'd sought him out, drawn by reputation as much as desperation. The realization should have been unsettling. It meant his quiet life of careful solitude was already changing, that his act of kindness had set something in motion that he couldn't predict or control. But as he watched the peaceful scene in his living room, the sleeping family, the watchful guardian, the warm light of his fire casting gentle shadows on fur and wood, and the accumulated treasures of a life shared with someone he'd loved, Silas found himself not afraid, but anticipatory. For 30 years, he'd lived with the respectful distance that marked most human-wildlife interactions. He'd fed creatures who visited his clearing, but they'd remained fundamentally wild, fundamentally other. Now sharing the intimate space of his home with beings who had crossed some invisible line between wild and domestic, between stranger and guest, he sensed possibilities he'd never imagined. The coffee finished brewing with a soft burble that seemed to wake the entire household. The cubs stirred, yawning to reveal impressive teeth, and began the slow process of emerging from sleep. Their mother stretched with the luxurious thoroughness of someone who'd slept deeply and well. And even the yearling rolled over and began the complicated task of arranging its long limbs for wakefulness. Outside, the storm continued, but with less conviction than before. Inside, 6 beings who had never shared space before began the delicate dance of learning to coexist, guided by instincts older than civilization and newer than hope. By the 3rd day, the storm had finally exhausted itself against the mountains, leaving behind a world transformed. Silas stood at his window, marveling at how the familiar landscape of his clearing had been sculpted into something alien and beautiful. Drifts rose and fell like frozen waves, and his woodshed looked like a snow-covered ship sailing across a white sea. The silence was profound, the kind of absolute quiet that only came after the earth had been buried deep enough to muffle every sound except the whisper of settling snow. His bear guests had settled into routines that amazed him with their consideration and intelligence. The cubs had claimed the area near the fireplace as their playground, wrestling with each other in bouts that looked fierce but never resulted in actual injury. Their mother watched these games with the patient attention of a parent who understood the difference between play and trouble. The yearling had discovered Silas's collection of books and seemed fascinated by the texture of paper and leather bindings, though it was careful never to damage anything with its powerful claws. The old male had appointed himself as the family's liaison with their human host. He watched Silas's daily routines with scholarly attention, learning the patterns of breakfast preparation, fire tending, and the careful rationing that stretched limited supplies across more mouths than they were intended to feed. When Silas moved to the kitchen, the bear would shift position to observe. When Silas added wood to the fire, the bear would emit that soft sound of acknowledgement that had become their primary means of communication. This morning brought a new development that would test the boundaries of their unusual arrangement. As Silas prepared his morning coffee, he heard a sound from outside that made him pause with the pot halfway to the stove. The distinctive crunch of something large moving through deep snow, followed by a familiar whiff of breath that was not quite like the sounds his current guests made. The old male's reaction was immediate and telling. His head came up, ears pricked forward, and he moved to the window with the silent grace of a creature whose survival had always depended on knowing who was approaching his territory. But instead of the tension that might accompany the arrival of a competitor or threat, the bear's posture suggested anticipation, even welcome. Silas joined him at the window, and what he saw made him understand that the previous night had been only the beginning of something much larger than he'd imagined. Through the diamond-bright morning light, dark shapes were emerging from the tree line that marked the boundary of his clearing. Bears moving in single file through the deep snow, following a trail broken by the leader, a massive female whose size and purposeful movement suggested she was someone of importance in whatever social structure governed the local bear population. Behind her came others, a procession that seemed to materialize from the white landscape like figures from a dream. Young adults and older cubs, a few more family groups, and several solitary bears whose scars and bearing marked them as survivors of many seasons. They moved without haste but with clear intention, each finding a position in the clearing where they settled to wait with the patience of creatures who understood that some things couldn't be rushed. By noon, 20 bears surrounded Silas's cabin. They arranged themselves in a rough semicircle, close enough to demonstrate their peaceful intentions, but far enough apart to avoid the territorial tensions that might arise from such an unprecedented gathering. Some dozed in the weak winter sunlight, others groomed themselves or their companions, and a few simply watched the cabin with the steady attention of visitors waiting to be received. Inside, Silas faced a crisis of resources that challenged everything he'd learned about mountain survival. His food stores, carefully calculated to last one person through the winter, were already showing strain after 3 days of feeding 5 additional mouths. Now, with 20 more bears waiting outside, he confronted a problem that had no precedent in any survival manual he'd ever read. The solution came from an unexpected source: Martha's old garden journal, a leather-bound notebook where she'd recorded not just planting schedules and harvest yields, but observations about the wildlife that shared their mountain home. Silas had looked through it occasionally in the years since her passing, finding comfort in her careful handwriting and practical wisdom. Today, desperate for any insight that might help him navigate his current situation, he found an entry that made him stop and read twice. The bears know things about this mountain that we're only beginning to understand, Martha had written during their 5th year in the cabin. They remember where the old apple trees grow wild, where the nut groves can be found, where emergency caches of food might sustain them through hard times. Silas thinks I'm being fanciful, but I believe they could teach us about survival if we knew how to. Ask. The entry was accompanied by a hand-drawn map showing locations around their property where Martha had observed bears foraging, places Silas had never explored thoroughly because his focus had always been on the immediate area around the cabin. Now, looking at her careful notations about bear pantries and winter stores, he began to understand that his current crisis might also be an opportunity. The old male, as if sensing Silas's dilemma, approached with something in his mouth, a stick. Silas realized, but not just any stick. It was straight, about 3 feet long, and bore the distinctive marks of bear teeth arranged in a pattern that looked almost intentional. The bear dropped it at Silas's feet, then moved to the door and looked back with an expression that clearly conveyed invitation. Silas stared at the stick, then at the bear, then back at the stick. In 30 years of mountain living, he'd learned to read the signs that nature provided to those who paid attention. This felt like one of those signs, though what it might mean was beyond his current understanding. Outside, the gathering of bears continued to grow. Word had spread through whatever communication network existed in the wilderness, carrying news of the human who opened his door to creatures in need. They came not as invaders or beggars, but as participants in something that had never happened before, a gathering that crossed the ancient boundaries between species, bringing together beings who had shared this mountain for generations, but had never shared trust. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the snow, Silas realized that his simple act of kindness had initiated something far beyond his control or comprehension. The question was no longer whether he could feed 20 bears through the winter, but whether he was brave enough to discover what they might be trying to teach him about survival, community, and the kinds of wisdom that could only be learned by stepping beyond the comfortable boundaries of a solitary human life. The stick lay at his feet like a key to mysteries he was only beginning to imagine. The decision to follow the old male's lead came to Silas gradually, like dawn breaking over familiar mountains. For 2 days, he'd studied the stick the bear had brought him, turning it over in his weathered hands, examining the deliberate pattern of teeth marks that seemed too purposeful to be random gnawing. The marks formed a sequence, deep gouges followed by shallow scratches, repeated along the length of the wood like some primitive form of notation. On the 3rd morning after the great gathering began, Silas woke to find the old male standing beside the cabin door, looking at him with that patient expectancy that had become their primary form of communication. The bear's message was clear. It was time to venture beyond the safety of the cabin's walls and discover what lessons the mountain held for a man humble enough to accept guidance from creatures he'd spent his life merely coexisting with. Silas, dressed for the cold with the careful attention of someone who understood that mistakes in mountain weather were often fatal. Martha's hand-knitted sweater went on first, the wool still carrying traces of her scent after all these years. Over that, his heavy coat patched and repatched until it resembled a textile history of his decades on the mountain. Thick gloves, boots rated for temperatures that could freeze exposed skin in minutes, and the walking stick he'd carved from mountain ash during his first winter alone. The bears outside stirred as he emerged from the cabin. Not with alarm, but with the quiet attention of a congregation, recognizing that services were about to begin. They remained in their respectful semicircle, but several of the younger ones shifted position to get a better view of what promised to be an unprecedented event. A human accepting an invitation to learn from bears. The old male led the way, breaking trail through snow that reached past Silas's knees but barely touched the bear's chest. Behind them, the other bears maintained their positions, though Silas caught glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision that suggested they were being followed at a discreet distance. The sensation was remarkable, to be surrounded by so many powerful predators yet feel utterly safe, protected by some understanding that transcended the usual rules of wilderness survival. Their destination became clear after 20 minutes of slow progress through the winter landscape. Hidden in a grove of ancient pines that Silas had passed dozens of times without truly seeing, a natural shelter had been carved from the mountainside, not by bears, he realized, but by generations of wind and water working on stone that was softer than the granite peaks surrounding them. The cave entrance was partially concealed by fallen logs and accumulated debris, but it was clearly a place that had been used, maintained, and marked by intelligent creatures for far longer than his brief residency on the mountain. The old male paused at the entrance, looking back at Silas with an expression that seemed to ask if he was ready for what lay beyond. Silas nodded, and together they entered a space that redefined his understanding of what wild animals were capable of creating and maintaining. The cave extended back into the mountainside far deeper than the entrance suggested, widening into chambers that showed clear evidence of purposeful organization. Along the walls, natural shelves had been enhanced with carefully placed stones to create storage areas. And stored on those shelves, preserved by the cave's constant cool temperature and protected from moisture by layers of pine boughs, was food, enough to feed a small army of bears through the harshest winter the mountains could deliver. Nuts, berries, roots, dried fish, even honey, stored in hollowed gourds that must have been collected from human settlements and repurposed for bear needs. The variety was staggering, but what impressed Silas even more was the organization. Different types of food were stored in different areas, and within each area, items were arranged by what appeared to be freshness or intended use. Near the entrance, easily accessible stores for immediate needs. Deeper in the cave, carefully preserved supplies for the lean months of late winter when fresh food became impossible to find. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering in from the entrance, Silas began to notice other details that challenged everything he'd believed about animal intelligence and social organization. Markings on the cave walls that resembled the scratches on the stick he'd been given, not random claw marks, but deliberate symbols that seemed to convey information. Near each food storage area, different combinations of marks that might indicate quantity, quality, or intended distribution. The old male moved through the cave with the familiarity of someone who knew every inch of the space, occasionally pausing to check specific storage areas or examine particular markings. When he reached the deepest chamber, he stopped and looked back at Silas, then deliberately touched his massive paw to a symbol carved into the stone wall, a circle surrounded by smaller marks that looked remarkably like a human's attempt to represent the sun surrounded by rays. Understanding came to Silas slowly, like pieces of a puzzle falling into place. This wasn't just a bear food cache, it was a community storehouse, maintained by multiple families working together across seasons and years. The symbols weren't random marks, but a record-keeping system that allowed different bears to contribute to and draw from shared resources. And the sun symbol that marked something special, something set aside for extraordinary circumstances. The old male led him to that special cache, and what Silas found there made him understand the true magnitude of what he'd stumbled into. Stored with extra care, wrapped in layers of pine boughs, and sealed with what looked like a mixture of mud and pine sap, were supplies that had clearly been gathered from human sources. Canned goods with labels he recognized from the general store in town, tools that had been lost or discarded by hikers and hunters, even a few items that looked like they might have come from cabins similar to his own. The bears hadn't just created a community storehouse, they'd been quietly borrowing from the human world, taking what was abandoned or unguarded and incorporating it into their survival strategy. They'd been watching, learning, adapting human techniques to their own needs in ways that demonstrated intelligence and social cooperation that rival anything human communities had achieved. As this realization settled over him, Silas felt the old male's gentle touch on his shoulder. The bear was looking at him with an expression that mixed patience with urgency, as if to say that understanding the cache was only the first lesson. There was more to learn, more to see, and the afternoon was advancing toward evening when travel would become dangerous, even for bears accustomed to winter conditions. But before they left the cave, the old male did something that would stay with Silas for the rest of his life. Moving to the special cache marked with the sun symbol, the bear carefully extracted a can of food, peaches in syrup according to the faded label, and placed it in Silas's hands. Then he touched the symbol again and looked directly into Silas's eyes with an expression that conveyed a message clearer than words. "This isn't just about survival," the look seemed to say. "This is about community, about sharing, about understanding that in the hardest times, the only way any of us survive is together." The walk back to the cabin through the gathering dusk carried a different weight than the morning's journey. Silas moved through the snow with the careful steps of a man whose understanding of his world had been fundamentally altered, carrying the can of peaches like a sacred trust. The old male walked beside him, no longer leading but accompanying, as if recognizing that the balance between teacher and student had shifted into something more like partnership. The bears gathered around his cabin had not remained idle during their absence. As they approached the clearing, Silas could see that the arrangement of animals had changed, becoming more organized, more purposeful. Family groups had formed distinct clusters, but the clusters themselves were positioned in a pattern that spoke of cooperation rather than competition. Paths had been trampled through the snow, connecting different areas, creating a network that allowed movement and communication across the entire gathering. Near his woodshed, several of the younger bears had been working together to clear snow from around the structure, creating access to the split logs he'd need to keep his fire burning through the remaining weeks of winter. The work showed evidence of planning and coordination. The snow had been moved methodically, piled in locations where it wouldn't interfere with other activities, and the cleared area extended in a pattern that would make wood gathering efficient even during future storms. At his cabin's entrance, another surprise waited. Arranged near the door, clearly placed there with intention, were offerings that spoke of the bear's own understanding of reciprocity and community responsibility. A collection of items that ranged from practical to puzzling: pine boughs that could be used for bedding or insulation, smooth stones that might serve as tools or weights, and several more sticks marked with the same deliberate tooth patterns he'd seen in the cave. But the most remarkable offering sat beside his door like a piece of furniture waiting to be moved inside. A large, flat stone that had been somehow transported from wherever the bears had found it, its surface worn smooth by water and time. On closer inspection, Silas realized the stone bore faint markings, scratches, and indentations that looked almost like a primitive map of the local area. Mountain peaks, valleys, even what might have been the location of his cabin, all rendered in a style that suggested cartographic thinking far more sophisticated than anything he'd imagined possible for non-human minds. Inside the cabin, the original family of 5 bears greeted his return with the comfortable familiarity of housemates who had spent their day in peaceful coexistence. The cubs had discovered his collection of carved wooden animals, pieces Martha had made during the long winter evenings of their early years together, and had arranged them in complex patterns on the floor that looked remarkably like the bear gathering outside. Their mother watched this play with the indulgent attention of a parent who recognized educational value in her children's games. The yearling had found Martha's basket of knitting supplies and had somehow managed to Extract a ball of yarn without damaging the other contents. The yarn now formed an intricate web connecting various pieces of furniture, not in the destructive tangle Silas might have expected, but in patterns that suggested the young bear understood something about the relationships between objects in space. As evening settled over the mountain, Silas began the familiar routine of preparing dinner, but with the awareness that he was no longer cooking just for himself or even just for his original guests. The bears outside would need food and his own supplies, even supplemented by what he'd learned about the cave cache, would require careful management to last until spring. The solution came from an unexpected direction. As he worked at his stove, warming the can of peaches the old male had given him, several of the bears outside began arriving at his door with contributions of their own. Not the random offerings of animals trying to curry favor, but carefully selected items that suggested they understood both his needs and their own ability to help meet them. Fresh fish, somehow caught from streams that should have been frozen solid, arrived cleaned and ready for cooking. Roots and preserved berries from the cave cache were distributed according to some system Silas didn't fully understand, but clearly didn't need to micromanage. Even firewood appeared, with younger bears somehow managing to transport split logs from his woodshed to the cabin entrance with the efficiency that spoke of organized labor. Most remarkably, the process was entirely peaceful. No competition, no aggression, no signs of the territorial behavior that should have made such a large gathering of normally solitary creatures impossible. Instead, Silas witnessed cooperation on a scale that challenged everything he'd been taught about animal behavior and social organization. As he prepared what had become a communal meal, working with ingredients provided by his guests and cooking for a household that now numbered in the dozens, Silas found himself thinking about Martha and the conversations they'd had about community, belonging, and the ways that isolation could both protect and impoverish a life. She'd been the social one in their marriage, the partner who maintained connections with the outside world, while he focused on the practical demands of mountain living. After her death, he'd gradually let those connections wither, telling himself that solitude was safer, simpler, more honest than the complicated negotiations that human relationships required. Now, surrounded by beings who had somehow created a functioning community despite lacking language, formal agreements, or any of the institutional structures that humans relied on for social organization, he began to question whether his choice of isolation had been wisdom or cowardice. The old male, as if sensing the direction of his thoughts, approached with something new, a piece of birch bark covered with scratches that looked different from the markings he'd seen before. More delicate, more detailed, arranged in patterns that suggested not just information, but something closer to art. The bear placed the bark carefully on the table beside Martha's favorite chair, then looked at Silas with an expression that seemed to pose a question. As Silas examined the markings by lamplight, he began to see images emerging from the scratches, representations of the cabin, the clearing, the surrounding forest, and throughout the composition, figures that could only be bears and humans living in harmony, sharing space and resources in ways that transcended the traditional boundaries between species. It was a vision of possibility, rendered in the oldest form of art known to intelligent beings, the desire to imagine a world different from the one that currently existed, and the hope that such imaginings might somehow become reality. Outside, the bear community settled into the routines of evening, their soft conversations creating a murmur that mixed with the wind in the pines, to form a lullaby that spoke of safety, belonging, and the kind of peace that could only come from knowing that one was no longer facing the world alone. The radio crackled to life on the 7th morning of the gathering, its sudden intrusion into the peaceful routine so jarring that Silas nearly dropped his coffee cup. He'd forgotten he even owned the device, an emergency radio Martha had insisted they keep for contact with the outside world during the worst weather. It had sat silent on its shelf for 3 years, its battery long dead, its purpose seemingly obsolete in a life that had found its rhythm in isolation. But someone had been trying to reach him, trying hard enough to boost the signal strength until it penetrated the mountains and found its way to his cabin. The voice that emerged from the static belonged to Tom Harrison, the sheriff from the county seat. A man Silas had known peripherally for 20 years, but hadn't spoken to since Martha's funeral. "Silas, if you can hear this, we need to talk. Got a situation developing down here that concerns your property. Wildlife Services is asking questions, and there's talk of a federal response team. Call me back if you can. This is important." The words hit Silas like cold water, washing away the warm sense of community that had been building over the past week. Wildlife Services meant government intervention, meant people who would see his current situation not as a remarkable example of interspecies cooperation, but as a dangerous anomaly that needed to be controlled, managed, or eliminated. He tried the radio's response function, but the device remained stubbornly silent. The incoming signal had apparently exhausted whatever power remained in its aging components. Looking around his cabin at the peaceful scene of bears living in harmony with a human, Silas realized that the outside world was about to intrude on something unprecedented and fragile. The old male, ever sensitive to changes in Silas's emotional state, approached with that questioning expression that had become their primary form of communication. But this time, Silas had no reassurance to offer. No gentle words that could explain the threat that was apparently approaching from beyond the mountains. Instead, he found himself moving to Martha's writing desk, a piece of furniture that had remained largely untouched since her passing. In its drawers, he knew, lay the accumulated paperwork of their life together, property deeds, tax records, and correspondence with various government agencies about the permits and permissions required to live. This far from conventional civilization, what he found among those papers changed everything he thought he understood about his current situation. Buried beneath utility bills and insurance documents was a letter he'd never seen before, addressed to Martha and dated just 3 months before her death. The letterhead bore the logo of the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, and the contents made Silas's hands shake as he read. The letter was a response to an application Martha had submitted, without his knowledge, a request to have their property designated as a wildlife sanctuary and research station. According to the correspondence, Martha had been documenting unusual animal behavior on their land for years, keeping detailed records of the intelligence and social cooperation she'd observed among the local wildlife populations. More than that, she'd been in communication with researchers at the state university, sharing her observations and photographs of behaviors that challenged conventional understanding of animal cognition and social organization. The letter indicated that her application was under serious consideration and that a site visit had been scheduled for the spring, following her death, a visit that had never occurred because no one had known to contact the agencies involved. But the most shocking revelation came in the letter's final paragraph. According to the Fish and Wildlife Service, Martha's property sat at the center of what appeared to be an unprecedented example of interspecies communication and cooperation. Similar behaviors had been documented at 3 other locations across the mountain west, all involving isolated humans who had developed unusual relationships with local wildlife populations. The government wasn't just interested in studying these phenomena, they were actively investigating them as potential evidence of rapid evolutionary adaptation in response to climate change and habitat pressure. The bears weren't just intelligent, they were apparently evolving new forms of social organization that included cooperation with humans as a survival strategy. Silas sat heavily in Martha's chair, the letter trembling in his hands as the implications became clear. His wife had known something like this might happen. She'd been preparing for it, documenting it, trying to ensure that when the outside world finally took notice, The response would be scientific study rather than governmental suppression. But Martha had died before she could complete her preparations. And now Silas faced the consequences of her foresight without the benefit of her planning. The bears gathering around his cabin weren't just seeking shelter. They were participating in something that might represent a fundamental shift in the relationship between humans and wildlife. Something that could have implications far beyond his small mountain clearing. The sound of helicopters in the distance confirmed his worst fears. The outside world had indeed taken notice, and they were coming with the full weight of federal authority behind them. Through his window, Silas could see the bears responding to the approaching aircraft with alert tension. Their peaceful gathering suddenly transformed into a defensive formation that spoke of generations of learned wariness about human intentions. The old male approached him again, but this time the bear's expression carried something new, not the patient curiosity of a teacher or the grateful trust of a guest, but the alert assessment of a leader preparing for conflict. In that moment, Silas understood that he was no longer just a mountain hermit who had showed kindness to some bears. He was the human representative in a situation that could determine whether this remarkable example of interspecies cooperation would be allowed to continue or would be destroyed by institutions that feared what they couldn't control moving. To his gun cabinet for the first time in years, Silas retrieved not weapons, but the camera Martha had used for her wildlife documentation. If the government was coming to investigate, he would give them something to investigate, not just the phenomenon itself, but evidence of what could be lost if bureaucratic fear overrode scientific curiosity. As the helicopter sounds grew louder, Silas began photographing everything: the organized layout of the bear gathering, the evidence of their cooperation and intelligence, the peaceful integration of species that conventional wisdom said should be impossible. If this was to be the end of something unprecedented, he would at least ensure that there was a record of what had been achieved. The old male seemed to understand what Silas was doing. Moving among the other bears, the massive creature appeared to be organizing them not for flight, but for presentation, arranging the gathering in ways that would demonstrate their peaceful intentions and remarkable social organization to whoever was about to arrive. Outside, the helicopters were circling now, their crews undoubtedly documenting the scene from above, while radioing reports back to superiors who would have to decide whether they were witnessing a threat to be contained or a miracle to be protected. In the few minutes remaining before the outside world intruded on their mountain sanctuary, Silas found himself hoping that Martha's vision would prove stronger than institutional fear, that the evidence of what was possible between humans and wildlife would outweigh the reflexive desire to control what couldn't be easily explained. The bears waited with him, their trust in his leadership now carrying the weight of their community's future. As the sound of approaching authority grew louder in the crisp mountain air, the helicopters landed in Silas's clearing with the practiced efficiency of a military operation, their rotors whipping the snow into blinding clouds that obscured everything beyond a few feet. Through the white chaos, dark figures emerged like phantoms, moving with the purposeful coordination of people who had done this many times before. As the aircraft powered down and the snow settled, Silas could see the scope of the response his situation had generated. 3 helicopters had delivered a small army of officials representing multiple agencies. Wildlife Services agents in their distinctive green uniforms moved to establish a perimeter around the bear gathering, their movements careful but clearly designed to contain rather than threaten. Behind them came representatives from the Forest Service, identifiable by their patches and equipment, followed by what appeared to be academic researchers carrying cameras and recording devices. The lead figure, a woman in her 50s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, approached Silas's cabin with measured steps. She carried herself with the confidence of authority, but without the aggressive posture that might provoke the bears into defensive action. Her approach suggested someone who understood that this situation required delicacy rather than force. "Mr. Cobb," she called out when she was still 20 feet from his porch, her voice carrying clearly in the crisp mountain air. "I'm Dr. Sarah Chen from the Fish and Wildlife Service. We need to talk about what's happening here." Silas stepped onto his porch, acutely aware that he was now the focal point of attention from both the human officials and the bear community that had gathered around his home. The old male moved to stand beside the cabin steps, not aggressively, but in a position that clearly identified him as Silas's ally and protector. The gesture was not lost on the approaching officials, several of whom stopped to whisper among themselves about the implications of such obvious cooperation between man and bear. "Dr. Chen," Silas replied, his voice steady despite the racing of his heart. "I assume you're here about my house guests?" "Your house guests," she repeated, and there was something in her tone that suggested both amazement and concern. "Mr. Cobb, what you've accomplished here is either the most significant development in human-wildlife relations in recorded history, or it's an extremely dangerous situation that could result in human fatalities and require immediate intervention." She gestured to the organized gathering of bears, many of whom were watching the proceedings with alert attention while maintaining their peaceful positions throughout the clearing. "We've been monitoring this situation via satellite for the past week, ever since reports came in about unusual wildlife aggregation patterns in this area. What we're seeing here challenges everything we understand about bear behavior and social organization." Behind Dr. Chen, the research team was setting up equipment with the systematic thoroughness of scientists who understood they might be documenting something unprecedented. Cameras, sound recording devices, and what appeared to be behavioral analysis equipment were positioned to capture every aspect of the interaction between the human and bear communities. "Ma'am," Silas said, choosing his words carefully, "these bears came to me seeking shelter during the storm. I gave them what any decent person would give to neighbors in need. They've been nothing but respectful and peaceful since they arrived." "Neighbors," Dr. Chen repeated, and again there was that tone of someone grappling with concepts that challenged fundamental assumptions. "Mr. Cobb, bears don't form communities like this. They don't organize cooperative food sharing or establish what appears to be a temporary settlement around human habitation. What we're observing here suggests cognitive capabilities and social behaviors that aren't supposed to exist in this species." One of the researchers approached Dr. Chen with a tablet displaying what appeared to be aerial photographs of the clearing taken over several days. "Ma'am, you need to see this progression. The organization isn't random, it's clearly purposeful. Family groups are arranged to maximize protection of cubs while maintaining access to resources. The paths they've created through the snow show evidence of planning and maintenance. This isn't just aggregation behavior, it's community development." Dr. Chen studied the images, her expression shifting from official concern toward something approaching wonder. "How many bears are we dealing with?" 23 at last count, the researcher replied, "and they keep arriving. We've identified at least 6 family groups, several solitary adults, and what appears to be a leadership hierarchy centered around that large male near the cabin steps." As if understanding that he was being discussed, the old male turned his massive head toward the officials and emitted that soft woof of acknowledgement that had become his characteristic greeting. The sound sent a visible ripple of reaction through the assembled humans, most of whom had never experienced such direct communication from a wild bear. "My God," whispered one of the Wildlife Services agents. "It's trying to communicate." "Not trying," said Silas quietly. "Succeeding. These bears have been communicating with me for a week now. They've shown me things about cooperation and community that put most human settlements to shame." Dr. Chen approached closer, her scientific curiosity clearly warring with her institutional obligations. "Mr. Cobb, I need you to understand the position this puts us in. If these bears have indeed developed unprecedented social behaviors, this could represent a critical evolutionary development that requires intensive study and protection. But if this situation becomes unstable, if there's any indication of danger to human populations, we'll be forced to take measures that neither of us want to contemplate. The weight of her words settled over the clearing like another kind of storm. Silas understood that she was speaking about relocation at best, elimination at worst. The peaceful community that had formed around his cabin could be destroyed by the same institutional mechanisms that were supposedly designed to protect wildlife. "What would it take?" Silas asked, "to convince you that this situation is stable, that these bears pose no threat to anyone?" Dr. Chen consulted with her team, their conversation conducted in the low tones of professionals grappling with a situation for which no protocols existed. Finally, she turned back to Silas with an expression that mixed hope with skepticism. "We would need to conduct behavioral assessments, document the social structures you're describing, and establish protocols for monitoring the situation without disrupting it." "But Mr. Cobb, this can't continue indefinitely. As word spreads about what's happening here, you're going to have more than government scientists visiting your property. Media attention, wildlife enthusiasts, people who might not understand the delicate balance you've apparently established." Silas felt the truth of her words like a physical weight. The peaceful sanctuary he and the bears had created was already under threat, not just from official intervention, but from the inevitable attention that would follow once the world learned about the mountain man who lived in harmony with a community of grizzly bears. The old male seemed to sense the tension in the human conversation. Moving with deliberate slowness, he approached the group of officials and did something that left everyone present speechless. He sat down in the snow and extended one massive paw toward Dr. Chen. Not aggressively, but in what could only be interpreted as a gesture of greeting or peace. Dr. Chen stared at the extended paw for a long moment, then looked at Silas with an expression of someone whose worldview was being fundamentally challenged. "In 20 years of wildlife management, I have never seen anything remotely like this, Ma'am," said one of her researchers, his voice tight with excitement. "We need to document this interaction. If this bear is demonstrating intentional communication with unfamiliar humans, it represents cognitive capabilities that could rewrite our understanding of animal intelligence." But even as the research team scrambled to record the unprecedented moment, Silas could see other developments that complicated the situation further. More helicopters were visible on the horizon, suggesting that word about the gathering had spread beyond the scientific community. The media attention Dr. Chen had warned about was already beginning to materialize. In the distance, the approaching aircraft suggested that his mountain sanctuary was about to become the center of attention from forces much less sympathetic than curious scientists. As the old male maintained his peaceful gesture toward the human officials, Silas realized that the next few hours would determine whether this remarkable example of interspecies cooperation would survive to inspire others or would be destroyed by the fear and misunderstanding that had characterized human-wildlife relations for centuries. The choice was no longer just about feeding bears through a winter storm. It was about defending a vision of possibility that could change how humans and wildlife shared the world. If it could survive the scrutiny and interference of a civilization that preferred control to wonder. The moment Dr. Chen reached out to accept the old male's gesture of peace, everything changed. Her gloved hand made contact with the bear's massive paw for perhaps 3 seconds, long enough for her research team to capture the interaction on film, long enough for Silas to see tears forming in the scientist's eyes. Long enough for the gathered bears to understand that at least some humans could recognize the significance of what they were offering. But the approaching helicopters carried a different energy entirely. As they descended toward the clearing, their aggressive rotor wash and aggressive landing patterns sent waves of alarm through the bear community. Cubs pressed closer to their mothers, adolescents moved toward defensive positions, and even the old male withdrew his paw and turned to assess the new arrivals with obvious concern. From the newly arrived aircraft emerged representatives of a different kind of authority. Military personnel, federal marshals, and officials whose patches and bearing suggested Homeland Security involvement. At their head walked a man whose expensive winter gear and commanding presence marked him as someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question. "Dr. Chen," the man called out as he approached, his voice carrying the tone of someone delivering ultimatums rather than seeking discussion. "I'm Director Walsh from the Department of Interior. This situation has escalated beyond fish and wildlife's jurisdiction. We're implementing immediate containment protocols." Director Walsh gestured to his team, who began unpacking equipment that looked nothing like the scientific instruments Dr. Chen's researchers had brought. These were containment devices, tranquilizer equipment, reinforced transport cages, and what appeared to be portable fencing designed to separate and control the bear gathering. "Director Walsh," Dr. Chen said, moving to intercept him before he could approach the bears, "we're in the middle of documenting unprecedented cooperative behavior. Any disruption to this gathering could destroy evidence of evolutionary developments that could revolutionize our understanding of wildlife adaptation. Dr. Chen, we have reports of a potentially dangerous concentration of predators in proximity to civilian populations. 23 grizzly bears represents a clear and present danger that requires immediate intervention, regardless of any scientific curiosity about their behavior." Silas stepped forward, feeling the weight of 30 years of mountain living behind his words. "Director Walsh, these bears have been living peacefully around my home for over a week. They've shown no aggression, shared resources, and demonstrated intelligence and cooperation that should be studied, not destroyed." Walsh turned his attention to Silas with the dismissive assessment of someone who had already decided that mountain hermits were not reliable sources of information about complex situations. "Mr. Cobb, you may think you understand these animals, but federal wildlife management protocols exist for good reasons. This gathering represents an anomaly that could have serious consequences if it spreads to other locations." "Consequences," Silas repeated, his voice rising. "The consequence of cooperation? The consequence of creatures finding ways to survive together instead of fighting each other. Maybe the problem isn't with the bears. Maybe it's with people who can't imagine that intelligence and community might exist in forms they don't control." Behind Walsh, his team was already moving toward the bear gathering with equipment that would allow them to begin separation and removal procedures. The bears responded to this aggressive approach with the first signs of defensive behavior Silas had seen since their arrival. Not aggression, but the alert positioning of a community preparing to protect itself. The old male moved to stand between the approaching officials and the rest of the bear gathering, his massive frame and authoritative presence creating a living barrier that no reasonable person would challenge. Behind him, the other bears arranged themselves in a formation that spoke of coordination and mutual protection, with the cubs and smaller bears protected by the larger adults. This is exactly the kind of behavior that makes immediate intervention necessary, Walsh said, gesturing to the bears' defensive positioning. Organized resistance to human authority represents a fundamental threat to established wildlife management protocols. But Dr. Chen was studying the scene with entirely different eyes. "Director, look at how they're organized. This isn't random defensive behavior, it's strategic positioning, designed to protect their most vulnerable members while presenting a unified front. This level of tactical thinking in bears is unprecedented." "I don't care how unprecedented it is," Walsh replied. "I care about containing a situation that could result in human casualties and media disasters. We're moving forward with separation and relocation immediately." As Walsh's team continued their approach with tranquilizer equipment, Silas realized that words were not going to be enough to protect the community that had formed around his cabin. The moment had come for action, for a choice that would determine whether this remarkable example of cooperation would survive or be destroyed by institutional fear. Moving to stand beside the old male, Silas placed his hand on the bear's shoulder and spoke in a voice that carried across the entire clearing. "If you want to separate these bears, you'll have to go through me first." The standoff that followed Silas's declaration stretched across the clearing like a held breath. Federal agents with tranquilizer weapons faced a 73-year-old mountain man standing beside a massive grizzly bear, while 22 other bears arranged themselves in defensive positions that demonstrated military-level tactical awareness. The tension was so thick it seemed to crystallize in the cold mountain air. Director Walsh signaled his team to halt, but his expression made it clear that he viewed Silas's intervention as a temporary obstacle rather than a legitimate challenge to his authority. "Mr. Cobb, you're interfering with a federal wildlife management operation. Stand aside immediately or face charges of obstruction and endangering public safety." "Public safety?" Silas repeated, his voice carrying 30 years of accumulated wisdom about what actually constituted danger in the wilderness. "The only danger here comes from people who think cooperation is something to be feared instead of celebrated." Dr. Chen moved between the two groups, her scientific objectivity warring with growing recognition of what was at stake. "Director Walsh, I'm formally requesting a delay in containment procedures pending completion of behavioral documentation. What we're witnessing here represents potential evidence of accelerated evolutionary adaptation that could have implications for wildlife management across North America." "Dr. Chen, your request is noted and denied. We're not going to risk public safety for the sake of academic curiosity about unusual animal behavior." But as Walsh spoke, something extraordinary began happening in the bear gathering. The old male, still standing beside Silas, began making a series of vocalizations, not the typical grunts and growls associated with bear communication, but a complex sequence of sounds that seemed almost like speech. The other bears responded immediately, each family group taking up the vocalization in turn, creating a chorus that rose and fell with the rhythm of organized communication. Dr. Chen's research team scrambled to record the phenomenon, their equipment capturing what might have been the first documented example of complex linguistic communication among wild bears. "Director," one of the researchers called out, his voice tight with excitement, "we're detecting patterns in these vocalizations that suggest syntactic structure. This isn't just noise. They're talking to each other." The vocalization sequence reached a crescendo, then stopped abruptly. In the silence that followed, the old male did something that left everyone present speechless. Moving with deliberate care, he reached into the snow beside him and withdrew an object that none of the humans had noticed before, a piece of carved wood, clearly shaped by bear claws, but following a design too purposeful to be accidental. The carving depicted the clearing around Silas's cabin, complete with representations of the cabin itself, the surrounding forest, and small figures that could only be bears and humans living in harmony. It was art, created by a non-human intelligence to communicate concepts that transcended the boundaries between species. The old male placed the carving at Silas's feet, then stepped back and looked directly at Director Walsh, with an expression that seemed to pose a question. "Can you destroy something this beautiful simply because you don't understand it?" The impact on the assembled humans was immediate and profound. Dr. Chen knelt to examine the carving more closely, her scientific composure finally breaking completely. "This changes everything," she whispered. "Tool creation, artistic expression, symbolic representation. These bears have crossed cognitive thresholds that redefine what we understand about animal intelligence." Even some of Walsh's team were lowering their weapons, staring at the carved representation of interspecies cooperation with expressions of wonder that overcame their training in containment protocols. The carving made the peaceful gathering around Silas's cabin impossible to dismiss as mere animal behavior. It was evidence of conscious choice, artistic vision, and hope for a different kind of relationship between humans and the natural world. Walsh himself stood frozen, clearly grappling with implications that extended far beyond his authority to manage or control. The carved wood at his feet represented not just unusual animal behavior, but a challenge to fundamental assumptions about human uniqueness and superiority that had guided wildlife management policy for generations. "Sir," one of his agents said quietly, "media helicopters are approaching from 3 directions. If we proceed with containment now, we'll be tranquilizing bears on camera while they're demonstrating intelligence that rivals human cognitive capabilities." The political implications hit Walsh like a physical blow. Images of federal agents destroying an unprecedented example of peaceful human-wildlife cooperation would dominate news cycles for months, potentially ending careers and reshaping public opinion about wildlife management across the country. In that moment of hesitation, Dr. Chen seized the initiative. "Director, I'm proposing an alternative. Instead of containment, we establish this location as a protected research site. We document what's happening here, study the implications, and develop new protocols based on evidence rather than fear." The old male, as if understanding that the moment of decision had arrived, approached the carved representation of harmony and gently touched it with one massive paw. Then he looked up at the assembled humans with an expression that seemed to say, "The choice is yours. You can learn from this, or you can destroy it, but you cannot pretend it doesn't exist." The future of human-wildlife relations hung in the balance, waiting for courage to overcome fear, for wonder to triumph over control. 3 months later, Silas stood on his porch in the gentle warmth of early spring, watching the snow melt into rivulets that carried winter's memory down the mountainside toward valleys where wildflowers were beginning to show their first tentative colors. The clearing around his cabin had been transformed, but not in ways that destroyed its essential character. The research station that Dr. Chen had established operated with the same respect for the land that had guided Silas's own relationship with his mountain home. The bears had stayed through the remainder of winter, their presence legitimized by the federal designation that protected both them and the unprecedented research they made possible. Scientific teams rotated through the site in carefully managed groups, documenting behaviors and communication patterns that were rewriting textbooks on animal intelligence and social organization. But the research was conducted according to protocols that the bears themselves seemed to approve, non-intrusive observation that respected their autonomy while allowing humans to learn from their remarkable achievements. The old male still served as the primary liaison between the bear community and their human observers, but his role had evolved beyond simple communication. He had become something unprecedented in the scientific literature, a wild animal who served as a cultural ambassador between species, facilitating understanding while maintaining the independence that marked his kind's essential wildness. This morning, like many mornings over the past 3 months, Silas prepared coffee for more than just himself. Dr. Chen had become a regular presence at his breakfast table, her enthusiasm for the ongoing research tempered by genuine friendship with the man whose kindness had made it all possible. She sat across from him now, reviewing notes from the previous day's observations, while the familiar rhythm of morning preparation continued around them. The linguistics team confirmed yesterday that the bears are using at least 47 distinct vocalizations, in patterns that suggest grammatical structure, she said, looking up from her tablet with the excitement of someone who still couldn't quite believe what she was documenting. They're not just communicating. They're developing language in real time, adapting their natural vocal abilities to convey increasingly complex concepts. Silas nodded, pouring coffee into the same tin pot that had started everything. The dented, blackened vessel had become something of a symbol for the entire project, proof that the simplest acts of kindness could have consequences that rippled far beyond their origins. Martha would have loved seeing this, he said, his voice carrying the warmth of memory rather than the weight of loss. She always said these mountains held more wisdom than most people were willing to recognize. Through the window, they could see the bears beginning their own morning routines. The original family of 5 had been joined by others throughout the winter, creating a community that now numbered 31 individuals representing multiple family groups and several solitary adults who had chosen to join the unprecedented gathering. They moved through the clearing with purposeful organization, some heading toward the forest to forage for the early shoots and roots that marked spring's arrival. Others tending to the complex social relationships that held their community together. The cubs from that first stormy night had grown larger and more confident, their play now incorporating elements that seemed designed to test and develop the communication skills they were learning from the adults. Yesterday, Dr. Chen's team had documented them using carved sticks to represent different members of their family group, manipulating the objects in patterns that suggested symbolic thinking that rival the cognitive development of young children. The implications keep expanding, Dr. Chen continued, her scientist's mind still grappling with discoveries that challenged fundamental assumptions about intelligence and consciousness. We're seeing tool use, artistic expression, linguistic development, and social cooperation that suggests these bears have crossed cognitive thresholds that we thought were exclusive to humans and a few other primates. But for Silas, the significance lay not in the academic implications, but in the daily reality of sharing his mountain with creatures who had become neighbors in the truest sense. They respected his property while making themselves at home in his world. They contributed to the community's well-being while maintaining their essential wildness. They had created something that had never existed before, a functioning partnership between species that preserved the autonomy of both while demonstrating the possibilities that emerged when cooperation replaced conflict. As if summoned by their conversation, the old male approached the cabin with something in his mouth, another carving, Silas realized, but different from the previous ones. This piece was smaller, more delicate, its surface polished smooth by careful attention. The bear placed it on the porch steps and stepped back with the satisfied air of someone presenting a gift. Silas picked up the carving and found himself looking at a representation of his coffee pot, rendered in wood with such accuracy that every dent and discoloration had been captured in miniature. Around the pot, tiny figures of bears and humans sat in circles, sharing what the pot had provided, not just coffee, but the warmth and community that came from offering hospitality to those in need. He's been working on that for weeks, Dr. Chen said softly. The level of detail, the symbolic thinking required to represent abstract concepts like hospitality and community through artistic expression, it's unprecedented in the scientific literature. Silas held the carving carefully, understanding that he was holding more than carved wood. He was holding proof that kindness, once offered genuinely, could grow into something that transformed everyone it touched. The bears had learned from his example of hospitality, but they had also taught him about community, cooperation, and the kinds of relationships that became possible when different species approached each other, with respect rather than fear, as spring established itself across the mountains and the research station continued documenting behaviors that would reshape human understanding of wildlife intelligence. Silas found himself looking forward to whatever would develop next. The partnership between his human community and the bear families had proven stable through winter's challenges. But spring would bring new tests and new opportunities. Sometimes the loneliest people do have the biggest hearts. Sometimes the wildest creatures know exactly who they can trust. And sometimes, when kindness meets intelligence with respect and patience, the result is something that changes the world in ways that start small but ripple outward like circles on a mountain lake. touching shores that no one could have imagined when the first gesture of hospitality was offered to creatures brave enough to scratch softly on a stranger's door during the storm of the century.